Okay, good morning to everybody. I think it's 9 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and I'll go ahead and start the class session. What I want to do before we get started is just to once again sort of go over where we've been, where we are, and I guess more importantly where we're heading. We started right before the first exam at the review session, that class session. Before last week's exam, talking about chapter 6, which is really the first true and pure macro chapter. And so, as I indicated yesterday in my introductory note to the class, that all the content going forward is going to be unique to macro. So a lot of the introductory content in the early weeks is material that is germane to both micro and macro. This will all be macro based going forward. And so we already started to open the door a little bit on it last time by talking about national income accounting, and that's really what we're going to be doing today and also into Wednesday. And I think we'll probably get through the remainder of what I wanted to get through. I'm sorry, not Wednesday, Thursday I meant. I think we'll get through everything on Thursday, but if I don't, then we can certainly roll that into next week with no problem. I don't really feel like we're too far behind, and I can always make adjustments to the chapters. As I've told the class before, I think that I would much rather stick more to the schedule of exams than I would to the schedule of chapters as they're sort of forecast when I create the syllabus. I'd rather drop off a chapter or two just in order to stay on track with the proposed exam schedule, because I realize that students sometimes make plans around these, time off work or travel plans, particularly for those who travel for work or those who have military deployments who are able to have maybe to work around that a little bit by taking exams earlier or whatever. So anyway, that's the proposed idea, is that I'm not terribly worried about the chapter order and where we are with regard to the syllabus, although I do try to stick with it as closely as I can. Chapter 8 will take us into unemployment, and we'll definitely be into that next week. Unemployment's an issue that's always with us, and it's one that we're going to explore in some further detail, including beyond just the most obvious form of unemployment, which is labor unemployment. We'll be talking about other kinds of unemployment as well. But mostly it'll be labor unemployment. And then chapter 10, we'll continue this discussion. So this will take us through the end of week 6. And so that's, I think, where we stand right now. We're in week 5 right now. I did want to talk a bit about the exam. Hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to have taken it. If you had any technical difficulty, and I think I heard from a couple of students who had a little bit of trouble viewing the graphics, and if you had that and it was a real impediment to you, let me know, because I only heard from 2 students, and this has been something that's come up before in Brightspace, and I have an idea why it's happening. I just don't know what the solution to it is, but let me know if it did come up, and I could be opening the door to a lot of questions and whatnot, but I'm willing to look into it. But it seems intermittent. It also seems like sometimes it's the type of device that's used. I know that, and I don't know if I even mentioned this at the beginning of class, but sometimes students have tried to take exams on tablets, or even worse, I would say cell phones, like smartphones and whatnot, and it doesn't tend to work very well. I don't know that there's enough memory in those to handle a lot of that, to keep track and not time out, to not go dormant and all that. I think it's probably a bad way to go with tablets or cell phones. Even though Brightspace was intended, one of the attractions was that it was supposed to be helpful with mobile devices. But anyway, I encourage you to not try to do that. And I just think from a standpoint of your own comfort and quiet and all that, I would get somewhere where you have an actual computer, if possible, even if it's like a Starbucks or whatever, just kind of curl up for an hour or two and just, or I guess an hour and a half is all you've got, and with a cup of coffee or whatever, and work on the exam. I think that's probably a better way to do it anyway. But that's up to you. Some people, we're all different. We all learn different. We all study differently. We all handle things a little bit differently as well. So, okay. So anyway, get with me if you do have any questions about that. I only heard from a couple with regard to that. And so those results should have been auto-graded. You should be able to see them if you click on My Grades, which is one of the top tabs in the banner area at the top of the page. Also, I had to set up a new Zoom link. For whatever reason, we can't keep the same Zoom link all the way through the semester. for just this class. I don't know why it's this class only, but so I sent you the new Zoom link. I did go in yesterday and take out all those announcements, because I do send out a new announcement and an email every time with a new Zoom link, or the same Zoom link, whatever, just so you know where you're going every time. So every time if you're watching us live, when you come to class, just go to the main page and just click on that link or copy it to a browser and go to there, okay? And obviously, if you're watching on a video, which seems like a lot of people are choosing to do today, that won't be an issue. But keep in mind that that will change if you do plan to come in and watch it live. Also, until we had the weather delay or the weather issue last week, I had intended to, as I had noted in class, I intended to have just an open Zoom link during the exam, and I would be here to answer questions. And obviously, that didn't happen. But I was available. I was at home because the campus was closed. But hopefully anybody who got with me was able to get through. Okay. All right. So I think that I've addressed all the old business and all the new business that we should do. Oh, one other thing, I did send out by email PowerPoint slides for this week. I think it says Macroeconomics - weeks 4 and 5. Chapter 6 was initially intended to go in week 4, and we just got a little bit behind with that. Nonetheless, that's so that's what the title of that is. I like to keep them sort of numbered by week, so that you know what goes what. And it's just a way that if you're following along, even if you're watching on the recorded, the class video that's recorded that I post in Brightspace, at least you can have those slides available, so you'll know what I'm looking at, because I'm looking at the same slides as you, and all it is sort of a way just to sort of organize the presentation so you can know what's going on. Okay. And I try to post those the evening. I just unfortunately I just can't do it right after the class session, because there's a class coming in right away, and it does take a bit of time to do the uplink. And it seems like during the day, I think our network is really busy. It's kind of slow anyway, so I can't really hold this other class back. Okay. All right. So let's go. Are there any questions for me? I only have a couple of people in the room right now, but if you do have questions for me about anything, feel free to shout out, and I'll be more than glad to answer any questions or clarify anything for you before we get going. So, all right. So what I want to do is this. I want to pick up from where we left off last time. So I talked on Tuesday last week about the idea of business cycles, and that's discussed in your text in chapter 6, the idea of business cycles, the ups and downs of economic activity. And we noted that there was a peak and there was a trough. Basically, from peak to trough is the top to the bottom of a business cycle. A business cycle being defined as the gyrations in economic activity, the fluctuations in economic activity. The downturns in economic activity tend to be known as recessions. Upswings tend to be known as expansions. Recessions have a very definite definition in economics, and that is 2 consecutive quarters, that is 3-month periods consecutively, so 2 of those consecutively, 6 months of declining economic growth. And we'll define that as what we call real economic growth, and I'll talk about what that means here in just a bit, because everywhere in economics we tend to qualify values by saying it's a real or a nominal. Real meaning it's adjusted for inflation, and that's becoming an increasingly important issue, particularly as we have a fairly high rate of inflation going at the moment. And we'll talk about what the responses might be to that as we go forward. And when we talked a little bit about stabilization policy, and this is far from the last time we'll talk about stabilization policy. A lot of what goes on in macro is talking about policy and what to do about economic fluctuations. And we have 2 forms of those: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Those would have been in your slides from last week. And that's really all that I just want to sort of go back and cover a little bit from there. We will obviously be revisiting those as we go forward, and we'll drill down in depth on what fiscal policy looks like and what it's all about, what monetary policy looks like and is all about as well. Okay, but those are coming up a bit later. Right now, what we're going to do is do some sort of definitional items, and I just want to go back just a little bit to talk about how we measure all of this economic activity. Okay. And when we talk about economic activity, the main number that we're looking at is something known as gross domestic product, or GDP. Gross domestic product, or GDP. And that is a dollar figure, okay? So we want to be clear that is a dollar figure. And it's defined as the total annual amount of final output created in an economy. Okay, and again, when we talk about final goods, we're talking about those goods which are done being processed by the supply side, and they're also done being distributed. They're ready to be used by some ultimate user, whether it's an actual consumer like a household, or whether it's a business buying something like a computer or a copier or whatever, or whether it's a government buying something like a jet aircraft. All these are final goods. What are not final goods would be pretty much all the output of farmers, which is all intermediate goods. So the wheat that a farmer grows is not a final output because it goes into grains to make bread and cereal and all those other kinds of things and all that. And or things like steel is not an intermediate. You don't go to the store to buy steel. Steel is used in construction, and it's used in vehicles and a lot of things. So steel would be an intermediate good. It would not be a final good. So, and the reason we are looking at final goods is because otherwise we would have double, triple, quadruple counting all throughout the economy to the point where none of it would make any sense. Just take the value of a car. If we were to double count, if we were to count the value of the car itself, along with the value of the steering wheel, the new tires, and I'm talking about a new car, and the battery, we'd be double, triple, quadruple counting. It would be a real mess. And so we're assuming that the value of those is captured in the final price. And that final price obviously carries a dollar figure, and that's how we measure the dollar figure of output. And when I talk about output, it's important to know, and I mentioned this last time, that GDP equals the total dollar value of output. And because it equals the total dollar value of output, it also equals the total dollar value of income. And this is an identity that is really non-controversial in economics, even though it might seem a little bit difficult to grasp. And that is the value of output must equal the value of income received somewhere. And that is the idea that if I'm producing output, if I'm a producer of goods, I'm being compensated for the production of those goods, and I'm being compensated in the form of income flowing into me. And here we want to talk about income a little bit differently than the way the accounting world or the financial world would look at it. If you've taken accounting before, you might see the term income and think net profit, maybe net profit after tax or whatever. Don't think about that. Think about just gross inflows to a producer for the production of a good. So if I'm General Motors and I sell a car to a dealership for $20,000, that $20,000 represents a macroeconomic income. Even though it might have cost GM $16,000 to make that car, meaning its net profit per car is only $4,000. This is not a profit figure. This is just a gross flow of dollars. So output equals income. The value of my output equals the value of my income. And this is an important identity that we should think about because, frankly, it wasn't always that clear to economists in general or to the general public and even to policymakers sometime before macro was created. And that's the idea that if you want to create more income in the economy, you've got to create more output in the economy. And the output has got to be compensated somehow with income. And we'll talk about what some of the policy responses will be to economies which are not achieving full employment. And we'll talk a bit more about what full employment is about as we get going a little bit deeper into this. And in fact, in chapter 8, we talk about something called the natural rate of unemployment. That's basically full employment. And however we define it, which, by the way, is, I wish I could tell you it's sort of nailed to the wall and it's never going to move. This is the figure that represents full employment, but that itself is a moving target. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so GDP equals output equals income, which equals an algebraic symbol that we'll simply refer to as capital Y. And the reason, and so whenever you see Y in macroeconomics, it really always refers to gross domestic product. Usually refers to an inflation-adjusted figure. For right now, we won't sort of muddy the water just yet with that difference between real and nominal. That is inflation-adjusted versus non-inflation adjusted. We will get there. But Y is a symbol that every time you see it, you think GDP. Now, where does Y come from? Why, right? And I think it really is a mathematical issue that has to do with dependency, where in algebra and calculus and all the math forms of math, Y is considered to be a dependent variable. That is, Y is a scoreboard figure. It doesn't do anything. It just reflects the action on the other side of the equation. That is the independent variables, which are subject to control or management. And we'll certainly be expanding that when we talk about how we measure output in the economy. Okay, so those are some introductory ideas. Output equals income equals this sort of algebraic symbol called Y. And usually it's sort of an inflation adjusted. But the thing that we want to know, and I mentioned this in the PowerPoint package, was all these terms are really used interchangeably. And I think it's important for us to note that is that that when sometimes we'll use the term output, sometimes we use the term income, and it sometimes might seem a little bit maddening, but we mean the same thing. And it's simply because the fact that the value of output equals the value of income. It's an important thing for us to know about. Okay. All right. So there are two approaches to computing GDP, and in truth, there are actually three approaches. And I'm going to try. I know this is not the best camera angle here. I'm only going to be on this for just a bit, but hopefully everyone can see what I'm doing here. Unfortunately, we can only work with it. I can't move the whole camera system. This is not Steven Spielberg. So there are two approaches to GDP accounting, and I'll talk about both of those. I'll probably spend the bulk of today's class session talking about the first of these, called the Expenditures Approach. I may get into a little bit of the income approach, which is the second piece. There is actually a third approach, which we're not going to be covering. But if you're having to Google some of this, you might see it somewhere. So be aware that I'm aware that it exists. We're not going to cover it here. So if we go back to the circular flow model, and I have talked about this before, and I've said, look, this model is useful, particularly in macro, when we're trying to illustrate relationships among multiple parties and multiple moving variables. And I had said before, we'll be adding bits and pieces of this to the discussion as we get going, including like the financial sector. We'll add them, we'll add the rest of the world, that sort of thing. But for right now, I want to take the green arrow. Remember, that was the financial flow, that was the money flow. And remember, this is how we're measuring the value of output in the economy, which is the value of income, is by dollars. And so there is an identity in everywhere in accounting and finance and economics, all of those. We don't always agree on everything, accountants and economists. One thing we do agree on, that the value of something has got to be determined objectively, and the best way to do that is by saying that the value of something is what someone's willing to pay for it. And it's also what someone's willing to receive for it. So what is the value of someone's wage? It's what someone's willing to pay for it. And so I know that people periodically get agitated at big sports stars who earn gigantic salaries, but unless you think that the owners of sports teams are completely out of their minds, it must be what that person's output is worth. So you get the idea. So we're talking about dollar flows. So when we talk about these, let's talk about one dollar flow we talked about before, and it was spending. It was spending by households. So spending by households is going to have a very specific term, and I think I might have talked about this before, that we're going to call consumption. In other words, given by the capital letter C. And I'm not going to include the physical flow here of the goods, whatever the goods in question are, but I will break down what the components of consumption are here in a minute. Okay. Spending by firms, and it's usually buying stuff from other firms, is what we call investment, and denoted by capital I. So it's firms buying things primarily from other firms that we call investment. Now here I want to differentiate, and I know your text gets into this, but I want to differentiate this idea of what investment means here in the economic context from what we might think of just in general, like if you go on to E-Trade or to Robinhood or whatever you buy stock, you might call that investment. And to you, that would be investment. That's what we would call financial investment. Economic investment is a little bit different, and it really has to do with investment in something physical which has a long-lived life. These are physical assets that are usually used to produce value down the road. But we'll talk about that. It's usually produced by firms, and it's taken up by other firms. So you notice the household sector is not involved in this, and that may be a bit confounding as we get into it, but I'll hopefully explain why that's the case. Okay. Also, we talked about government spending is another issue. Government tends to buy things from business firms, doesn't it? And so as a result, we have government expenditure here. So government they buy a lot of the same things that private companies buy, filing cabinets and vehicles and uniforms and machinery and all that. So as a result, government expenditure we'll simply call G. But also government employs people. And so as a result, we've got G here as well. So we've got government expenditure going in this direction. And the only reason I put government in the middle here is not because of some sort of centralized role like a central government, but it just does the government does sort of link the economy together because pretty much every actor has got some sort of connection to government. So as a result, it sort of makes sense to sort of situate this in the middle. Although, as I've said before, it doesn't really make any difference how you organize the circular flow model. Okay, so we've got consumption, investment, government expenditure. So government, and by the way, government employs people. So people provide labor to help to government. So there's a physical flow of labor, just as it is in the employment scheme of things. And then there's the government expenditure arrow, which compensates for that labor. But also government provides things to households in forms of benefits, such as things like Medicaid and Medicare and student assistance and Section 8 housing benefits. I mean, it's a long list. We could be here all day, but Social Security being a big one, right? So those are all issues that go along with that as well. So and one final bit of this is this. And it looks like firms is sort of the hub here, and maybe that's the case, maybe even more so than government. But there is a figure which takes us into the rest of the world. So if we were to simply limit our discussion here to this, right, we would simply call this a closed economy. That is, nothing comes in and nothing leaves, right? This is sort of the Gilligan's Island model, and maybe I'm showing my age here by talking about Gilligan's Island. I don't know if anyone can see this. Basically, show people are stranded on an island, and nobody comes in, nobody leaves. No goods come in, no goods leave, so they're stuck there. They're isolated. They're on their own little economy, I guess you could say. They're very small at that. But if our economy was closed, that is, was not open to the rest of the world, then it would simply look like this. This would be the example of at least just the financial flow of the circular flow model. That is not taking into account the rest of the world. But what if we did bring in the rest of the world? Because most economies in the world are not closed, most are open. So if we open this to the rest of the world, which includes goods coming in, goods leaving, people coming in, people leaving, money flows coming in, money leaving, then we are talking about a more modern economy. And by the way, when I say modern economy, we're talking about the economies the way they've been for the last several hundred years, really since the beginning of the Enlightenment, when trade really began to happen, with better transportation and sort of a more adventurous spirit, the spirit of entrepreneurship, where people wanted to trade with others, that they weren't sort of holed up in their own little bailiwicks, their own woods, or their own valley or mountain or whatever, that they wanted to trade with others. And so most economies are open. Today, I mean, it would be really hard to point to too many closed economies, except the most isolated places on Earth. And they've got to be rapidly disappearing, I would think. I know that after the tsunami in, what was it, 2005, 2004, 2005, the tsunami that happened in the Indian Ocean, there were some aid workers who were traveling around the Indian Ocean to small little islands and whatnot, just basically see if they could offer help, medical aid and food or whatever. And there were some of these islands that clearly had not seen outsiders, and they view them with a lot of suspicion and hostility, and so those would probably be characterized as closed economies, but very small. Today, the biggest closed economy I can think of, and it's not totally closed, but it's pretty close, is North Korea, which doesn't do a lot of trading with its neighbors. It's a command economy. Most of the all the big decisions are made by government. It's not market-based at all, and it doesn't have a lot of connection with the outside world. It's a very strange place, North Korea, no question about it. Okay, so we're talking about most economies being open economies. Well, how do we manifest this? What are we talking about? Well, let's talk about the flow of dollars here, okay? So we know about imports, we know about exports, right? So imports are basically goods coming in. So if goods come in, it must mean that those payments must be going out. Imports, we're going to call M, and M is simply for whatever reason, I don't know where M comes from, but M equals imports, okay? Imports are simply defined as goods produced elsewhere brought into some country, right? We all know that, that's nothing too difficult, but it's whether or not you know that that's M or not, that is not completely clear. Why is the arrow going out? Because the goods are coming in. So all we're doing here is sort of following the money, right? So import payments are money going out. On the other hand, what about exports? Exports are goods produced in a country and sold to foreign buyers. And as a result, export payments are money coming into a country. So the goods go out and the money comes in. Goods go out and the money comes in. So again, these are dollar flows. Or if you took this very same model and you transported it to another economy like France, we'd be tracking the value of euros in terms of imports and exports and government spending and investment and all that. Or if we're talking about the Norwegian economy, it was the kroner is their currency. So I use the U.S. economy as the example here. I think it's probably the most realistic to use, although with the exception of the very few closed economies, a lot of these ideas are fairly easily transportable. Where we sort of differ from a lot of other countries is the role of government, and every government's got its own sort of unique take on how to address its economy. So this is the circular flow model from the standpoint of these flows here. So we've got consumption, investment, government spending, and exports. And we're going to talk about one connection here between those two. That's what is the difference between those two when we're talking about accounting for income. So I'm going to go to swivel the camera back here if I can, and I hope everybody can see that. Hopefully I wasn't losing everybody on that. So I tried to do the best I can with that. So let's see something here a minute. Trying to make my screen a little bit bigger just so that I can see what's going on. Okay, so are there questions about that? All right, well, let's take up the where we left off with regard to GDP accounting, which on Tuesday last week, I mentioned this falls into the general category of what's called national income accounting. And the entity of the US government that does the accounting, does the computing, is called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the US Commerce Department based in Washington. And they do extensive amount of research. And it didn't go very well the last course I had where we did the Zoom, and I tried to do a screen share where I actually got into showing some of the data. I'll try to do, and it's a lot easier in a physical classroom because I can just go on to website and just project the computer image on the screen. I'm not sure it's going to work as well with a Zoom session, but if you ever go onto the VEA website, you'll find it's a very, very dense, data-rich environment, and it goes back many decades. And so if you're really interested in economic history, to see what was the value of housing produced in 1950 or whatever, you could definitely get that. And it's probably pretty reliable. The data gets a little sketchier before 1940, even though you will often hear documentaries on TV saying the value of someone's wages in 1800 was whatever in today's dollars. It's a little bit of a stretch to be able to do that for a lot of various reasons. But national income accounting basically is the way that we account for the value of all this. In other words, we're trying to count what is the amount of activity. Okay, that's going on. And keep in mind too, this system keeps on going. Government expenditure isn't a one-shot deal. It doesn't just stop. Investment isn't a one-shot deal. It stops. Consumption doesn't stop. It goes on and on and on and on. It's like a wheel that keeps flowing. And by the way, you've also got, for every green arrow that's going in one direction, you've got red arrows going in the other direction. That's what makes an economy go. So you've really got two different approaches to macroeconomics. The first of these is called the Expenditures Approach. That's what I'm going to spend probably most of the time today talking about. And it's the measurement of GDP accounting from the demand side of the economy, which is basically what we're talking about here. We're talking about the money flows. We're talking about the demand side of the economy. And so let's talk about this in terms of how we measure it. Okay. The other approach is just the opposite. It's the income approach. It's the supply side of the economy. And because if you're a supplier of anything, whether it's goods or whether it's labor, you're compensated for that in terms of income. And so that income is accounted for. And so the value of the expenditures approach must equal the value of the income approach because output must equal income. That's an identity. And by the way, when it doesn't balance, it's sort of forced to balance, and we'll talk about that. We may not get to that today, but that may be coming on Thursday. Okay, so let's talk about the expenditures approach. It's the first of these. It's, by the way, it's probably the one that economists point to the most, mostly because I think that there is, I guess, sort of a built-in bias toward demand and approaching macroeconomic issues by looking at it from the demand side of the economy. Certainly, there's an entire school of economic thought which approaches economic problems mostly from the demand side. So whether or not that's your particular point of preference or not is up to you, but we'll study both of them actually. So let's talk about the expenditures approach, and let's sort of tear these. I'm going to use the board. I guess it's kind of nice that I've got a nice whiteboard to work with here. And so let's say that we've got GDP, and GDP again is the same as Y, which is that dependent variable. And so we're going to say that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the final term here is the difference between exports and imports. And that difference, this term here, the plus, which is the difference between the two, is called net exports. Net exports, and we'll talk about what net exports are, how they affect the economy, etc. Okay, so C plus I plus G plus or minus net exports. Sometimes this will end up being a negative term if M is greater than X. If X is greater than M, or just simply remain a positive term. But a plus and negative is a negative, and so you can sort of figure out the math on that, okay? All right, so let's take these individually. Let's talk about consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and let's sort of tear into these individually and spend some time talking about them. And if you have questions, I urge you to feel free to jump in and hit me with your questions. Particularly if you think I'm not really addressing something, and I'll be more than glad to stop and go from there, okay? All right, so we're talking about consumption spending. We are talking about spending by households. I mean, consumers are all of us, right? So all of us live in some sort of household, presumably. And so as a result, household spending is consumer spending. This differs from investment spending in the sense that consumer goods are very definitely those which are final goods. Consumers tend not to buy intermediate goods, which doesn't mean you can't go down to Home Depot and buy a pallet of lumber and whatnot, and go from there. In that case, it could be considered a final good, or some concrete or something like that. But for the most part, we're talking about goods which are final and ready to be consumed. And there are three different categories of consumption spending. Let's talk about what these are. The first category is what are known as durable goods. This may be a term that's familiar to you, may or may not be familiar with. These are goods which have an expected life of at least 3 years. Okay? Expected life of at least 3 years' time. At one point, if you're looking at maybe an older textbook, you might see that those were 5 years. It used to be that durable goods had considered a 5-year life. I think the reason why that is no longer applicable is because of things like electronics, like cell phones and computers. And a lot of those, even though a cell phone and computer might definitely have a life longer than 3 years, whatever that technology is often replaced within that 3-year cycle, just simply the technology replacement cycle. These companies that make these goods have to keep making new goods, because what's the point of making us an iPhone that someone's going to have for the rest of their life, right? You want them to buy more iPhones down the road, and with computers and all that. So they've got to be made better. And the same goes with TVs and everything else. And we'll talk about some of the criticisms of GDP accounting from that particular standpoint a bit later. We talk about. So durable goods, expected life greater than or equal to 3 years. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about things like cars and trucks and motorcycles. Pretty much any kind of vehicle, I think, would be safe to say would be considered a durable good. Also, appliances would fit into this category: washers, dryers, television sets, stereos. Furniture is a big category, believe it or not, considered to be durable goods. These are all goods bought by consumers. So this would not include things like forklifts or 18-wheelers, right? Those would be considered durable goods. And if you're an individual who buys an 18-wheeler, you must be using it for a business purpose, which would make that fall under this category. So we're talking about goods that are for consumer use. Now, there is some error in this, I am sure, because it's one thing to say that, okay, what do businesses buy to run their businesses? Things like stationery. They may run you out to buy a case of stationery from Staples or whatever. But you can do the same thing. And how do we know what's consumption and what's investment? It doesn't really matter that much because it's, first of all, it's all going to go into the GDP category. And for the most part, things which are sold by Staples are generally considered consumer items, unless they're very clearly for business use only. Something like a cash register is not going to be something you're going to have at your house, probably. And if you do, for whatever reason, then you must be a business. And so it's for a business particular purpose, okay? So durable goods, all those examples, vehicles, furniture, appliances, those goods which are expected to last 3 years. You would not include anything related to housing here, okay? That does not go into this particular category for reasons that I'll get to here in a minute. So those are all durable goods. One thing about durable goods that we should talk about that's important to note is this. They tend to be, and I'll put this in quotes because I suppose this is in the eye of the beholder, that these are considered to be big ticket items, and they're often financed by borrowing. Okay, so I put the term big ticket in quotations there because not everybody buys cars with financing. Some people pay cash, most people do not. But most people do, but not everybody finances things like appliances and furniture and whatnot. So, but it is, big ticket items, but they are oftentimes financed by borrowing. And the reason I bring this up is because when we get talking a bit later in the course about demand, which has interest rate sensitivity, durable goods will come up as being a subject of this. That is very much subject to the interest rate environment. Now, what's interesting about interest rates, and we haven't talked at all, that I know of about interest rates so far, is the idea that, and I've been doing this for quite some time, but we really haven't talked about in our macro courses, problems with interest rates. Interest rates, moving quickly in one direction or the other, or upsetting the economy, or pricing people out, because interest rates have been so low for 20 years, really, and almost historically low. And for the length of time they've been this low, it's been pretty remarkable, actually. That is set to change beginning next month, but probably gradually. And I wouldn't expect major changes in interest rates, but things will probably be changing, mostly to sort of try to slow down some of the demand, because the economy is going pretty well. At least unemployment is falling, but inflation is rising. So that sort of suggests that we need to slow things down a bit. And so as a result, rates will probably rise as a result of that. Some of this we'll talk about, but we talk about finance by borrowing. The big relevant point here is the idea that it's interest sensitive. So big ticket items is financed by borrowing. So those are durable goods. And there's a reason why earlier on in the class we went through this discussion of goods versus services. And it's really mostly it's because of this issue here of durable goods versus non-durable goods. And then the third category, which is not goods at all, but are services. And so non-durable goods are everything but all physical goods that are not durable in nature. And it's a big category. Food, clothing, things like medicines, and just everyday items like detergent and household cleaners and mops and sponges. You name it, goes on and on. Boots and shoes, all those kinds of things. These are all non-durable goods. That is, they're not big ticket items necessarily, and they're oftentimes not financed by borrowing. It doesn't mean you can't, buy, groceries with a credit card, but it tends not to happen as much. And if it does happen, it tends not to be very interest sensitive. Okay, and that interest sensitivity is going to come up again a bit later in the course when we talk about demand for actual money itself, and how the demand for money is itself interest sensitive. Okay, so non-durable goods are goods, and they're goods as goods, and not goods as the euphemism for goods and services. Excuse me, the way we define that earlier on, that is the idea of goods being distinct from service. So even though, so now it looks like we're trying to have it both ways, doesn't it? That we use the term goods as a euphemism for goods and services to represent all the red arrows here. But now we're being very specific in sort of tearing into this. Well, there's a reason for this. And one of the reasons for it is the fact that the behavior of these categories, durable goods, non-durable goods, and the third category are different. And it's important for us to know what's going on. I mean, let's step back and think about what is the whole purpose of macroeconomics in the first place. It's to study economic events so that we can know what to do about economic problems. It's why study anything if you intend not to do something about it, right? Why study dentistry unless you want to solve dental problems, that sort of thing, right? Or engineering, unless you want to solve engineering problems. And so that is important. So here we do really have to differentiate goods from services. And so non-durable goods then are simply those goods which are physical goods. I mean, all those characteristics that we talked about, they're inventoriable, they can be moved around, they can be lost, stolen, burned up in a fire. But these are considered non-durable. And it's a big category of all these kinds of things. And so it's a lot of the things that we would buy at the retail level at things like department stores, grocery stores, drug stores, those kinds of things. Pretty much everything there would be considered a non-durable good, I would imagine. Whereas a lot of durable goods would be at things like appliance stores, dealership type locations, things like that, okay? So, and these tend to be a lot less interest sensitive. And the reason for this is very simple. These tend to be more routine purchases, where these tend to be more planned purchases. And you know, when the time is right, we'll buy a new car. Or, hey, I think our dryer is going to go out. Well, let's see if we can get another 6 months out of it or whatever, right? You usually don't say that about a pair of shoes. Let's see if I can, these shoes are wearing out. Let me see if I can get through 6 months. I mean, I'm not saying that never happens, but that's not really the case. Or I'm not going to buy shampoo for another month or whatever, right? I mean, that just is not really, it's not really a thing, is it? Non-durable goods are routine purchases. So therefore, they're really not interest sensitive, are they? I mean, even if you were to finance it with a credit card, I don't know that would be, you know, something where you'd be looking at the interest rate saying, I don't know if I want to buy the Del Monte green beans or the Green Giant green beans. I just don't think that would really come up as a thing. So durable goods, non-durable goods, what's the third category here? Services. So there's a reason again why we talked about goods versus services. And that's one of the, we made a distinction, even though we sometimes want to have it both ways by talking about goods and services. So what are services? So services go back to that original definition that we provided before. They tend not to be inventoried, right? There's no way to really move them around, put them on a truck and move them or shoplift them. It tends not to work like that, does it? They also tend to be produced and consumed at the same time. And because of that, there's the inventoriable nature of them is mostly irrelevant. And then one thing that we said about it was whatever physical evidence of the provision of that good is oftentimes mostly just incidental. Includes something like, I can give the example of going to a lawyer and getting a will done. So the lawyer charges you $1,000 or whatever, and you walk out of the legal office with pieces of paper. Well, you didn't pay $1,000 for pieces of paper. You went there for the services of the attorney preparing the will, right? And a lot of those kinds of things. Now, here's the thing about services, and I want to maybe sort of bust a bubble on some myths about services that are probably wrong, but you know, I think contribute to a misunderstanding of economics, and we already have enough trouble in this realm by people having misunderstandings of economic events. But there are those who will point to services and the rise of services in the economy and say it's a bad thing. And by the way, of these three categories, which of these is growing fastest? Services, no question about it. Services are growing much in terms of production of goods in the economy and demand for those goods, because you can't produce something if nobody wants to buy it. And services are very much in demand, and it's growing faster than the durable goods sector, which at times is very up and down. It's very volatile, mostly because of the the way the business conditions are and employment conditions and all that. It's not. This is more volatile, certainly than non-durable goods, but services tend to be relatively stable. Also, tend to be fairly high value output. So it's the value that's created by firms that don't have to really invest in lots of equipment and inventory. And so it's fairly easy to start a service business. The biggest obstacle may be just the training and the licensing and all of that. And very often the providers of this do have to have some sort of licensing, whether it's as a cosmetologist or an accountant or an engineer or whatever, architect. These are all services which they're not producing physical output that they're putting on a truck and delivering. They're delivering the value of their own personal expertise. Medical services are a huge part of this category. In fact, when we talk about healthcare in general, it's a complicated issue. And I know that we could do an entire semester on healthcare economics. Of where I went as an undergraduate, they just offered an entire doctoral degree program on healthcare economics. That's how big of an issue, big of an important issue it is. Healthcare is a big one, and we tend to dump it under services, even though there are a lot of non-durable goods that are services such as prescription drugs and things like medical things like bandages and pill boxes. And and then there's some of the durable goods like wheelchairs and hospital beds and gurneys and all of the heavy duty equipment in hospitals, those sorts of things. So it's not really easy to categorize all of healthcare, which is one in six of every dollar spent is somewhere in the healthcare sector of the economy, which is large. And I think we're tempted to just dump it all into services by saying it's all doctor's services. Well, it's not just all doctor's services, because doctors, they prescribe medicine, but they don't produce medicine. And if you go to Walgreens to demand prescription drugs, you're getting a prescription that's a physical good. It's not a service, really. The advice from your doctor certainly is, and the treatment by your doctor is. But so it's kind of difficult to know where to put healthcare. It's probably the biggest area in terms of sector in the economy, and it's growing all the time. And this was long before COVID. It just grows and grows and grows. I know during the 1990s, when President Clinton was trying to overhaul the healthcare system, or the health insurance system, I should say, which is what eventually did sort of get done under President Obama. At that time in the 90s, healthcare spending was about $1 in $7 in the economy. Today, it's about, by the time President Obama got around to actually achieving that particular goal, it was about $1 in $6, on its way to $1 in $5. And so, and again, this is long before COVID, and it's mostly a function of the fact that these treatments and these healthcare solutions are getting more and more expensive as we push the limits of what we can do for people. And it really is truly amazing. A lot of these ailments that people had that were once fatal, people are surviving, particularly cancer treatments. I mean, cancer used to be really, really, really bad news. And it's not good news anytime. I don't mean to suggest that. I certainly had enough cancer in my family to tell you that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is on the way out, because there's so many good treatments for that did not exist before. So it's difficult to really categorize healthcare. I just want to bring that up just because it is a big issue. It does come up from time to time. And one of the reasons why it's also growing is the fact that the population is getting older. So old geezers like me are getting older. We're consuming more healthcare, and that's going to be a continuing issue as we get going throughout. As the elderly get, as a lot of these baby boomers, of whom I'm on the tail end. I'm on the very tail end of the baby boom generation as we get older. But fortunately, I don't think I'm responsible for too much healthcare demand, but there are those that are. So durable goods, non-durable goods, services. Okay, and all that falls under the consumption category of C. Okay, so questions about that and what these are all about. Services, again, include all those goods which cannot be inventoried easily, and include all kinds of things. I mean, the list is long and long. Oh, one other thing I meant to say, and I kind of got sidetracked, was that some bemoan the rise in services and say, well, a couple of things which are wrong and which are important. And then they say that it's a bad thing. Why? Because they say we're not making things in America anymore. And I know what they're saying, and they point to a lot of heavy industries that have been beset by hard times. The auto industry, certainly, which is up and it's down, it's up and it's down. It sometimes looks like it's on its last legs, and other times it looks like it's going great guns. The steel industry, same with that. Lots of these other heavy manufacturing firms that make stuff, physical goods. And those have come on some hard times while services have grown. Well, it doesn't really make any difference from the standpoint of how income is earned and where the income comes from. Because if an economy produces $20 trillion of services or $20 trillion of goods, it's still $20 trillion of income arriving. Now, that doesn't speak to the idea that there could be efficiency issues. We talked about this with regard to allocative efficiency. If all we're producing are potatoes, right, $20 trillion of potatoes, that's probably not a very good way to invest our nation, our inputs in society. We should be producing a lot of other stuff besides potatoes, right? We should mix it up a little bit, right? But nonetheless, in terms of income, it doesn't really make any difference. So but the argument is that, hey, we're not producing stuff. First of all, it's not even true that we're not producing stuff. What America is producing from a standpoint of physical stuff is a lot more high-tech things like jet aircraft and networking equipment and medical products and a lot of high-tech gear and communication systems and satellite capabilities. And a lot of the lower value outputs, frankly, have been offshore to other parts of the world that are producing them cheaper, and which, if you are a shopper at Walmart or Family Dollar or whatever, you're probably the beneficiary of what are some fairly low-priced outputs because they have low-priced. I realize there are low-value inputs going into it, notably labor costs. So it's not true that we're not making goods. The other thing to rebut the issue about services as being a bad thing is the idea, if we go back here, and that is the idea that we've got a major gain with the rest of the world in terms of services, and it's a big boost to our economy. So I just kind of want to, I kind of got on that idea and I forgot to finish my thought. So it's important to realize that services are a good thing, that they don't necessarily denote a bad thing. Okay, that's the first category, consumption. What about investment? One other thing about this is, and I just sort of went to point this out, when we talk about consumption in the national income accounts, this is known as personal consumption expenditures, PCE. I bring that up only because if you are an adventuresome soul or looking through the BEA website and you stumble upon the expenditures approach and you'll see consumption, it'll probably be listed as personal consumption expenditures. Also, there's an inflation measure that tracks these goods here, goods and services, right? And it's called the PCE index, which is a favorite inflation measure that members of the Federal Reserve Board are said to prefer over some other measures. We'll get to inflation a bit later, but that's called PCE. Okay, what about investment? This, since we're on the subject of initials here, is known in the national income accounts as gross private domestic investment, GPDI, gross private domestic investment. So that's just how we would know it if we were looking in the national income accounts, gross private domestic investment. Key word here is private, because private means what? It means non-governmental. So when you're talking about the demand for an office building, if it's a private company that wants to buy an office building, or a real estate developer or a property manager, then it'd be a private investment. If it's the government building a new post office, that would be government spending, right? So it's different depending on who is doing the demanding. Okay, so that will matter a lot, particularly when we talk about fiscal policy and deficits and debt, because we want to sort of blow down some of the myths with regard to that have been erected, these mythical barriers that people think are really an issue with debt, which we're going to sort of take issue with, that government borrowing involves. And one of those is the idea that government, borrows money to do a lot of its expenditures, and a lot of people consider that to be a bad thing. We'll talk a bit about that later. But I did want to highlight the idea that private means non-governmental. So what are we talking about here when we talk about investment? Well, the first category of this is something called fixed investment, or FI, which used to be called, so if you're looking at older textbooks, it used to be called BFI, business fixed investment. Somewhere along the line, the term B got dropped, and it's just known as fixed investment. So what is fixed investment? It is pretty much analogous to what we talked about with regard to the factors of production. That is the idea that the capital piece, which was machinery, equipment, technology, all the things which are used as inputs into the production process, right? Now, these are final goods, remember, but they're used to produce other goods. And that's why, and they're purchased by businesses, which is why they're called investment. So what does the term investment really mean from an economic standpoint? I think early on in your textbook, even maybe as early as chapter 1, the term investment was discussed, and that was the idea of an expenditure on something which has future value, future service value. And that's pretty much the way investment is sort of like the word capital. It's got a lot of different specific meanings depending upon how it's being used. But the one overarching meaning is that something is being done now for some payoff in the future, right? And that's really what investment is. Even if you said, I'm investing in my education, well, you are, right? It's an investment. What you are doing today is an investment in your long-term future by investing in higher education, no question about it. So in this case, though, even though all that general category works for all manifestations of investment, we are talking about economic investment, and we're talking about something which will have future service value, which, by the way, is in the accounting world sort of the definition of an asset, something which has future service value. So this is firms buying things to be used in the production process. And so they would include things like machinery and equipment and 18-wheelers and cranes and forklifts and conveyor belts. These are not things you would buy at your house, right? You wouldn't have a forklift at your house, probably. And if you did, that would probably make you a business, because why on earth would you want a forklift at your house, right? So as a result, these are business inputs, and the outputs then become inputs into the production process. But they are final goods because they're done being produced. They're ready for final purchase, and so that's why they're there. So fixed investment. Now, one thing about it is this: they strikingly are very sensitive to this idea that to durable goods, in the sense that they are often also big ticket items, usually, right? And they're often financed by borrowing. And one thing about it is this: that it is very interest sensitive. It's very interest rate sensitive. And one of the things about this interest sensitivity is, you could say this really about every item in this category itself, but interest rate sensitivity is a big defining characteristic of everything in the I category. So we'll be getting to that a bit more. So fixed investment is all those things which are unique to businesses, even things like dumpsters and whatnot. I mean, they're just things that only businesses would buy, but they've got a long life. They oftentimes tend to be financed by borrowing. So you get the idea. So that's fixed investment. That's the first category there. The second category is new construction. And here's where people get a little bit confused at times, because when we talk about new construction, we're talking about real estate, which is defined as simply land and everything attached to it. Now, the land itself has already been produced sometime 4 billion years ago, so that's not considered to be part of the new value being created. But anything that goes onto the land, including things like fences and sidewalks and whatnot, and parking lots, is considered part of construction, in addition to the actual structure itself and the fixtures that go into it. All that's new construction. That's new value that never existed before. Okay, so that's important to note there. By the way, what about like remodeling? If you're a business of remodeling houses, and so your business is selling that to customers, well, that would be a service, right? That would be a service that somebody's paying for you to come in and remodel their bathroom or whatever. So new construction is often part of business spending. Here's the thing that throws people at times. There are really 3 categories of this, and there are actually probably more, but I'm going to sort of, just in the interest of brevity, residential construction is the first. You might say, whoa, why isn't this a durable good? Aren't houses big ticket items often financed by borrowing? Yes, they are, but we're not talking about somebody buying a house that was built in 1980, because the value of that house was captured in the GDP of 1980, presumably, right? Because so that's not new output. When we're talking about GDP, we're talking about the new value creation. So new construction is new residential housing. And by the way, who is the first demander of residential construction? It's a builder, right? So now, I know that people would sometimes say, well, what if I build my house myself, right? And I buy all the materials and I build it myself. I know how to do it, and I can build my own house. Well, that would effectively make you a contractor, wouldn't it? It would effectively make you a business, even though you're not selling it to anybody, you're selling it to yourself. that would really make you a business. And it's really not, there can't be that many people who do that. I'm sure there are, I know there are, as a matter of fact. But there are also people who do things like make their own soap. I've got an uncle who makes his own wine. You wouldn't want to drink it, but you get the idea. There are people who do make their own thing. I think my wife has a relative who grows his own tobacco, right? And makes whatever he makes with cigarettes or whatever. So there are people who do their own output. It cannot be a large part of what's going on. So when somebody builds their own home, yes, that would probably be an exception. But for the most part, new residential construction is built by builders, which are firms. And so that's investment in something which will have a long, useful life. And so as a result, all investment is for future value. So residential construction goes into this, which is, by the way, not just single family homes, but it's also multifamily construction, whether that's apartments, condominiums, townhomes, or these sort of multi-use structures, which are properties that have things like commercial facilities and then people live up above it and whatnot, which are actually pretty interesting. If you can, live in a condo above an area, you go downstairs and there's a subway and a swimming pool and all that good stuff, that's kind of interesting. So, but all that would be new construction, mostly residential. Okay. What about the next category would be something like retail. So retail and commercial. Obviously, these are two different categories, but we'll put them together here, mostly because of the fact that there is, one of the things about retail and commercial properties is that there can be a degree of interchangeability between these structures. That is, a retail space could be a daycare for 5 years, and then it could be an accountant's office, and it could go back to being a daycare, then it could be a hair salon, then it could be a pet grooming location. And so retail and commercial, they can kind of go back and forth between those kinds of things. I'm not saying it always happens. I know there are zoning issues in a lot of localities, but sometimes it's not clear what is retail and what's commercial. We think of commercial space as being mostly office space, and that's probably true, right? And so as a result, but we put those together, retail and commercial together. And then one final category, just on the construction piece, is industrial property. And I haven't even gotten into things like agriculture and agricultural construction and whatnot, which we could certainly get into and carry, or even things like entertainment complexes, like you build a racetrack or whatever. I mean, yeah, there are lots of other categories. These are the biggies, though. What about industrial that makes it different than retail and commercial? Because it is a business, right? And that's the idea that tends to be whatever it's intended to be is whatever it's intended to be forever. That you're probably never going to be able to convert it from what it is now to something else. So if it's a steel mill, it's always going to be a steel mill. You're probably not going to take a steel mill and convert it to a football stadium or a Home Depot. It's just probably not going to happen, right? So those are limited use for what they are. So new construction goes into this category. Again, we're talking about the general category here of investment. And I want to try to get to government spending before we wrap this up, and then I'll get to net exports on Thursday. What's the final category? Well, the final category is one that was also maybe a little bit surprising, and it's not a particularly huge portion of GDP, but it is important and it is quite volatile, and that is changes in inventories, which we would simply use the symbology of delta IMV, changes in inventories. Changes in inventories are important because they are, once again, sort of harbingers of what is to come in the economy. And here, what I want to do is I want to sort of stress something that I think a lot of times we don't always get the best information, particularly from sort of mainstream news outlets when it comes to economic events. And I'm not slamming the media just because it's sometimes fashionable to do so, or some people think it's the right thing to do. I'm just simply saying it's been a complaint of economists for a very long time that we sometimes don't always hear the correct information or it's misinterpreted. And so, as an example, when it comes to inventories, Inventories are reported pretty much once a month, mostly once a quarter though. And the Commerce Department, it tracks inventories. Inventories are defined as those goods which are sitting on shelves or on lots and are ready for final sale, but have not yet been made final sale. But they've already been produced, so they're already accounted for in GDP. Whether or not somebody comes in and buys that new truck is irrelevant. It's already been accounted for in GDP, and it goes into inventories as an uptick in inventories. Now, here's the thing, which is a bit misleading we sometimes hear on the news, is that say the government reported that inventories are rising. And sometimes the news, the reason I bring this up is because I've heard this too many times, where the interpretation is, oh, the economy must be slowing down because goods are now stacking up, people aren't buying them. When in fact, that may be just the opposite. The reason that firms are raising inventories is because they expect future sales. And so as a result, they're ramping up on their inventories because you can't sell what you haven't got, right? So as a result, that may not be the case that people are staying away and that goods are stacking up on shelves. So that could be misleading. Another is just the opposite case in which the government reports that inventories are falling, and the interpretation might be, hey, it must be the economy is doing well because goods are flying off shelves. Maybe not. Maybe it's the fact that suppliers understand a slowdown is coming. They're dialing down their production of goods, and the retailers are dialing down their purchases of goods because they don't expect to sell as much in the future. So you've got to be a little bit careful with changes in inventories and how it's interpreted. And you've really got to drill down into it to find out what is going on, what inventories are being affected, and why. One big area that fluctuates a lot is oil, where sometimes we have huge buildups in oil, and sometimes we have very much of a drawdown in oil. About, what was it? I think it was like a year ago, last April, we had a case in which it was the early stages of COVID, where we had just so much oil, that is crude oil, in the country that the actual price of oil on the mercantile exchange actually turned negative. It was a negative price. And I know people will say, well, how can it be negative? I mean, are they going to pay me to go buy gas? That's not really how it works. And I don't want to get too deeply into the woods. The way to understand that price is to understand that there is a futures market. Primarily, people lock into their price at some point in the future. The problem is nobody wanted any oil because nobody knew when the slowdown from COVID was going to come to an end. And so as a result, oil was just sitting around in gigantic pools. And one thing about oil production is it's not just like turning a switch and turning it off. I mean, once oil starts, being produced, it's really hard to sort of shut it down. It's not as easy as what it might seem like. So, but that was one example of an inventory where it was just building up and building up and building up. And so you really would have to understand why it's happening in order to know what the effect is on the economy, okay? One thing about inventories is this, and it goes back to kind of what I talked about before, that when changes in inventory is rising, that's a plus. Remember, this is GDP equals, this is an equation, right? C plus I. So if all this is rising, then that's a plus. That's an increase to GDP in general to the economy. So buildups in inventories are not necessarily a bad thing because they're all accounted for in GDP. And in the case of something like an oil buildup, well, then that could be something that is a bit of alarming just because of how we got there, okay? But we have to be a little bit careful in our interpretation of some of this, okay? All right, so questions about that. All right, I do want to cover government, and then when we come back on Thursday, we'll have one final term here in this equation, and that is the net exports piece. But right now, let's talk about government expenditure. And this won't be quite as lengthy of a discussion because, well, we've only got about 6 minutes, but that should be ample time. So, like a lot of things, we talk about the view of a macroeconomy, the generic view of any macroeconomy from our own federal, from our own national situation here. And so taking the United States, we basically have two levels of government in the US, federal and state. You might say, well, where's local, where's county and all that? Well, state government, local and county government, city and county government is an extension of state government in the United States, okay? So we really have a distinction between federal and state. This is what federalism is about. This is when the nation was created from a legal, political standpoint. It was created as a federalism, and that was the idea initially was that many states with lots of sovereignty and strength and a weak federal government. Today, I think a lot of us would not agree that the federal government is weak. In fact, if anything, we have a very strong federal government and maybe a not so strong state governments. So that may have shifted at some point over time. But we're talking here primarily about spending and its impact on GDP. Remember, the expenditures approach is the demand side of the economy, and government is like another actor. They can demand goods, right? It's just those goods differ a little bit because they tend to buy things which are not bought by either households or firms, right? So what about government expenditure? Well, I'm going to make one bit of distinction here. We talk about federal spending. We've really got two categories. And this is how this is going to differ from the US view versus the non-US view. If we took this as a Canadian example, we probably wouldn't break it down like this. But the US has a very, very large defense budget. And so we categorize federal spending very broadly as two categories: defense and everything associated with it, and non-defense. And the reason for this is the fact that we have a tremendously large amount of spending on national defense. It's the largest in the world by far, by far, by far. The former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was also an ex-Army officer, had said that the U.S. is #1 in defense spending. The #2 in the world was actually #10. That's how far the U.S. was out in front. And it is a source of some controversy to some who think that we're spending too much money on national defense. And as a result, would prefer others to, or for us to dial it down and maybe have others spend more. Former President Trump had long had that belief, long before he became president, was talking about the fact that the U.S., in his view, and it's his own view, was the fact it was spending too much on defense and not enough on other things. Now, his view was that other countries should jump in and assist in that, but some would take an opposite argument. Some who are opposed to as high a defense spending level as the idea that this could all be shifted in this direction and non-defense. Things like public education, welfare assistance, aid to needy families, things like roads and and infrastructure and all that. We've certainly heard that word infrastructure a lot since President Biden has taken office. He's had some trouble getting that infrastructure, all the bits of his infrastructure through. They kind of broke that into some pieces, and he's having a little bit of trouble right now getting some of his things through. But the reason we break this up is because the U.S. has a very large spending on defense, and it's not really my job, I guess, to say if it's too high or too low. I'm simply presenting what people feel about it and the objective reality of the fact that it's a very large figure, and we can have its own category than everything else. So it's defense and everything else, and defense includes everything related to it, not just military expenditure, but intelligence, which all goes into the defense budget and all that. Okay, non-defense is everything else, and primarily what we're talking about is all the administration of government, plus all of the social services that the federal government provides. This would not, however, include Social Security, and we're going to talk about that, or Medicare for that matter, and we'll talk about that a bit later, because sometimes, and politicians are guilty of this very often, in talking about Social Security, saying it's going to break the budget and whatnot, where in fact, every single dollar of Social Security benefits does not account for a single dollar of debt to the U.S. economy at all, because it's paid for by people's payroll taxes, and it's big. People who are working now are paying for the benefits people are getting, and there's been a surplus in this for years. It's just that the math does not tend to be very fortuitous going forward, because we got a lot of baby boomers retiring, and we baby boomers did not have anywhere near the number of children that our parents had. So as a result, there are fewer younger people to take up the slack. It may very well be, and we're already seeing this. I was born after 1960, and so I got to be 67 to get full benefits. Whereas my older brother was born in 1959, he can draw full benefits at 65. So there are changes to that to account for the fact that there are more older people and whatnot. But Social Security does not go in here. You're not going to see Social Security here. And the reason why is it's a separate system, separately funded system, which is not to say it's perfect. There are issues with it, no question about it, but it is not part of this, right? And in fact, it's what we call a transfer. So the dollars you would get from Social Security are not dollars you created by earning it, even though I wouldn't make that argument to somebody who is getting the benefits, because they would say, what do you mean I didn't earn it? But it's rather you're getting it in the form of a transfer of somebody's taxes today. I realize you have to pay into it in order to get benefits. And you don't get benefits unless you're eligible, but it's not a savings account, it's not a pension, it's not a retirement account, it's something different, okay? So there's that. And then state government, which basically has two main categories, and that is law enforcement. The vast majority of law enforcement in this country is done by state and local governments. Yes, we have a federal FBI and DEA and all that, but for the most part, it's really done, including the entire criminal justice superstructure of probation and prosecutors and corrections and all that. But law enforcement is a big one. Also, things like public education is also a big one. Most public education, despite the federal government's occasional involvement in this, it's really more of a state function. And I'm talking about public education, not private education. It's like parochial schools or private universities or whatnot. This would be state funded, state supported, state regulated. So law enforcement and public education, and also other things that would go in this category would be things like public infrastructure. The term infrastructure basically deals with or relates to all these sort of connective tissue that ties the economy together: roads, bridges, canals, communication systems, all that. Okay. All right. So are there questions for me? Because we're just about out of time. In fact, I think we are out of time. I'm willing to answer any questions, but if not, I will pick it up on Thursday with the net exports piece. And then I'll give a bit of a discussion about what this all means in terms of the relative contribution of these and why we feel the need to break these into these four categories. Okay. So anyway, hopefully you get all this down, and we'll pick it up with net exports on Thursday. Have a great day. See you next time.